Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Today is August 21st, 2025, and we're starting with some really significant breaking news that just hit the wires.
Absolutely. It's pretty major.
The New York Appeals Court has just handed down a huge decision. They've overturned that massive, $500 million plus civil fraud judgment against former President Trump.
That's right, over $500 million.
Reports are coming in fast. MagGator, Slay News, Zero Hedge, Twitchy, OANN, even Reuters, they're all calling it a total victory. The court basically tossed out the penalty as excessive.
This was, in that case, brought by the New York AG, Letitia James.
Exactly. The one where Trump was ordered to pay hundreds of millions, banned from doing business in New York.
Yeah.
All this despite, arguments that the banks knew what they were doing, did their own checks. The loans got paid back.
And crucially, the sources emphasize no actual victims claiming that they lost money.
Right. So this is a huge development.
It really is. And this decision, it immediately brings a concept right to the forefront, something our sources have been talking about a lot. Lawfare.
Ah, yes. Lawfare.
People are seeing this court decision now not just as a legal ruling, but maybe as a big turning point in what these sources describe as a much larger strategic battle using the legal system itself.
Okay, so imagine a world where legal challenges become weapons in a political war. Today, we dive into that reality, where the stakes are nothing less than the future of our justice system.
That's the core of it.
In this deep dive, we're going to explore this idea of lawfare and also what the sources call the deep state. We'll focus on how these tactics, according to the materials, have allegedly been used against Donald Trump.
Yeah, our mission today is really to pull out the key insights from these sources you provided, understand the arguments they're making, and think about what it all means for, the rule of law and American democracy.
And it's important to note the material presents a specific viewpoint, doesn't it?
It definitely does. It highlights concerns from certain perspectives about the justice system getting politicized, governmental institutions maybe being used improperly, the idea that the line between normal politics and, weaponized law is getting blurry.
Okay, let's unpack this. Lawfare. What exactly is that in the context of these sources? Why should you, listening, care?
Well, according to these sources, lawfare is basically the strategic use of lawsuits and legal processes. But it's often politically motivated, designed to harass, intimidate, slow down, or just neutralize a political opponent.
So not necessarily about finding truth or justice in the traditional sense.
The sources argue its main purpose often isn't that. It's more about shaping how the public sees things, using the courts to achieve political aims. Some sources use really strong language, calling it legal assassination.
Wow. Legal assassination.
That's intense. Yeah. They say it's designed to, quote, bankrupt, ruin, defame, and even imprison a dangerous political opponent. So, the takeaway for you is understanding how the legal system itself might, according to these views, be turned into a political tool.
And how does that actually look in practice? How does this legal assassination manifest?
Often, the sources say it shows up as what they call the criminalization of politics. So, taking things that might be normal political activity or maybe minor violations and blowing them up into serious criminal charges.
Kind of stretching the law.
That's the argument. Many sources draw parallels, maybe concerning ones, to tactics you might see in places they call banana republics or, dictatorships, where the legal system is just openly used to crush opposition. That really challenges democratic norms, doesn't it?
It does. Now, what about the other term that comes up constantly in these sources? The deep state. What do they claim that actually is?
Right, the deep state. The sources describe it as essentially unelected federal bureaucrats, people within the government agencies who, in this view, think they should be running the country, sometimes against what the elected officials or the public want.
So not like a formal group, but more of a network.
Exactly. It's portrayed as this kind of tangled web of bureaucracies, parts of the media, lobbyists, all sort of working together. One source even compares it to an organized crime family operating for generations.
An organized crime family, really?
That's the analogy used. And in this narrative, Trump is seen as the outsider, the whistleblower, trying to drain the swamp, as he put it.
And the motive? Why would this deep state, as they describe it, target Trump?
Well, according to the sources, the primary motive was simply to destroy Trump. Because he challenged the way things were done in Washington, he rejected what they call the administrative state, that sort of permanent power structure within the federal agencies.
Okay, let's get concrete. Let's look at some specific examples from the sources, starting on the civil side. That New York civil fraud case, the one brought by AG Letitia James, which we just talked about.
Yes, that's a prime example, according to these materials.
Yeah.
The case alleged Trump inflated property values to get loans. But the critical argument from the sources, the one they hammer home, is the no victims point. Meaning the banks involved, like Deutsche Bank, they did their own homework, their due diligence. The loans were all paid back with interest. So the sources ask, where's the actual financial harm? Who lost money?
And despite that, the original ruling was huge.
It was. Judge Engoron hit Trump with hundreds of millions in penalties, banned him from doing business in New York. The sources widely called that ruling grotesque, malicious lawfare. And that's the ruling that just got overturned today by the appeals court.
Which is a huge deal.
It's central to the sources' argument. They highlight this fundamental legal debate. Does a fraud claim require an actual victim who lost money, or is just misrepresenting things enough? Today's appeals court decision seems to lean towards needing that tangible harm, at least in this specific case.
And the sources point to political motivations behind the original case too, right?
Oh, absolutely. They frequently mention that AG James basically campaigned on promising to go after Trump, quote, bagging Trump. Plus, there were allegations about the judge, Judge Engoron, his daughter's ties to Democratic fundraising efforts.
So the argument is, this wasn't just about the law.
The argument from the sources is that standard practices in New York real estate were essentially criminalized, but only because the target was Trump. It makes you think, doesn't it? What happens to the law when politics gets involved so heavily?
Okay, let's shift from civil to criminal. The Manhattan hush money case. DA Alvin Bragg. The sources were very critical of that one too.
They certainly were. You had Trump indicted on 34 felony counts. But the sources point out these were related to how payments were recorded misdemeanors originally, and the statute of limitations had run out.
So how do they become felonies?
Well, that's the controversial part, according to the sources. They were upgraded to felonies by Bragg's office, alleging they were done to hide some other crime, though what that other crime was remained unclear for a long time.
And the sources called this
a sham trial, a political hit job. Strong words. They raise serious concerns about due process, basically, fairness. They point to the judge, Juan Merchan, noting his daughter works as a Democratic political operative, calling him conflicted.
And Bragg himself.
They often mention him being Soros-funded. The overall goal of getting that conviction, the sources claim, was simply to label Trump a convicted felon president heading into the election.
Were there legal experts questioning this case?
Yes, the sources often quote figures like Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley, prominent legal scholars who called the case lousy, a clear weaponization of the criminal justice system. They also point to the jury pool. Biden won Manhattan by 86%. Trump got only 12% there in 2020. Made it tough to argue for an impartial jury, the sources say.
Okay, what about the election interference cases? Those also generated a lot of discussion.
Right. You had federal charges from special counsel Jack Smith concerning actions after the 2020 election, and then those racketeering charges in Georgia from DA Fani Willis. Both used RICO statutes.
RICO, like for mobsters.
Exactly. Originally designed for organized crime. The sources argue these cases were basically trying to criminalize political speech and the act of legally challenging election results. They say that sets a really dangerous precedent for anyone questioning an election in the future.
And criticisms of the prosecutors themselves.
Oh, yeah. Jack Smith was accused by the sources of timing his actions to interfere with the 2024 election. Fani Willis was criticized for using RICO to make seemingly ordinary activities look criminal, plus all those questions about her relationship with Nathan Wade, the special prosecutor she hired, and alleged coordination with the January 6th committee and the Biden White House.
But there's been very recent news on those fronts, too, hasn't there? Big developments.
Huge. Just now, reports are saying special counsel Jack Smith has asked to dismiss the January 6th charges against Trump, and he's dropped the appeal in that Florida documents case. Looks like he might be heading out of the DOJ altogether.
Wow. And Georgia.
Also big news, the Georgia Court of Appeals has put a stop to everything in the Trump REO case there. Everything's on hold until they rule on whether to disqualify Fani Willis. The sources are saying that case is now, quote, most certainly not happening before the 2024 election.
So major setbacks for those prosecutions.
That's how the sources are framing it, yes. Significant victories for Trump's legal team.
So with all these different cases, the civil, the criminal, if the sources see them as flawed or politically motivated, what do they claim the ultimate goal was?
Well, pulling it all together, the sources argue the overarching aim was, quote, to bankrupt him, destroy him mentally and physically, and brand him as a criminal felon. Basically, to take him off the political map using the legal system, damage his image permanently.
And this strategy, according to the sources, it wasn't just confined to lawsuits and courtrooms, right? They describe a much broader effort they link to this deep state.
Exactly. It's portrayed as a multi-pronged attack. One huge example they always bring up is the Russia hoax.
Tell us how the sources describe that.
They call it a phony narrative built on fabricated claims of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. They say it was laundered through things like the Steele dossier and orchestrated by high-level Obama administration officials and the Clinton campaign.
Any evidence cited for that?
The sources point to things like declassified documents suggesting the FBI knew back in 2016 about a potential Clinton plan to smear Trump with a Russia connection, but didn't act on it. And then there's that letter from 51 former intelligence officials just before the 2020 election.
The one about the Hunter Biden laptop.
That's the one. They signed a letter calling the laptop story Russian disinformation. The sources often cite polls suggesting a large majority of Americans think Trump might have won in 2020 if that story hadn't been dismissed like that.
That's a pretty explosive claim. What other broad tactics do the sources highlight?
Another major one was the effort to kick Trump off the ballot using the 14th Amendment. You saw this in states like Colorado, Maine, Illinois. Officials or courts tried to use the insurrection clause to disqualify him.
And the sources saw this as
Pure lawfare. They called it an unconstitutional attempt to rig the election by preventing people from even voting for him. They often point out that the groups pushing these cases, like CREW in Colorado, were activist groups, some identified as having funding from George Soros. So again, alleging political motivation disguised as legal action.
It really sounds like the sources are describing a systemic effort, maybe even involving federal agencies.
That's precisely the argument. They claim agencies like the FBI and CIA were weaponized against the Trump campaign and then his administration. They mention people like Kash Patel, who worked in the Trump administration and claimed to expose deep state elements within the FBI, NSA, and so on.
Weaponized how?
Well, they point to things like the FBI losing key text messages between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, those top officials who were very critical of Trump during a critical investigation period, or reports alleging the FBI paid informants to go after Trump supporters. The overall picture painted is one of institutions being turned against a political target.
Okay, so given this whole landscape of challenges described by the sources, how significant are these recent developments, the appeals court ruling today, the Jack Smith news, the Georgia pause?
Extremely significant from the perspective of these sources. That New York appeals court decision overturning the $515 million judgment, they're calling it a total victory.
And the Jack Smith situation.
Him dropping the appeal in Florida, moving to dismiss the J6 charges, that's being seen as a major collapse of one of the main legal fronts. Same with the Georgia case being halted indefinitely pending the Willis disqualification ruling. It means that case is effectively off the table before the election.
So the sources see this as a turning point.
Many do. Some are using phrases like death knell for Democrats' lawfare. They see it as proof that these strategies, while damaging, aren't invincible and are facing real pushback within the legal system itself.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean going forward? If these efforts were so intense but are now facing these kinds of reversals?
Well, it shows that even if you accept the premise from these sources that there were concerted lawfare and deep state efforts, those efforts aren't foolproof. They have vulnerabilities, they're being challenged, sometimes successfully, within the very legal system they were allegedly trying to manipulate. It suggests the system, or parts of it, still has checks and balances that can function.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've explored these concepts of lawfare and the deep state as presented in the source material, looking at the specific legal fights involving Donald Trump, civil, criminal, ballot access.
And we've highlighted these very recent, very significant legal turnarounds, the NY appeal, the Jack Smith developments, the Georgia halt, which suggest, according to these sources, that these tactics might be hitting some serious roadblocks.
Why is understanding all this important for you, our listener?
Because ultimately, this discussion touches on fundamental questions about fairness, impartiality, and the role of our legal and governmental institutions. It's not just about one person, whichever side you're on. It's about the health and integrity of the republic, the principles of justice that are supposed to apply equally to everyone.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider. What happens to a nation when a large part of its population starts to see the legal system not as a neutral arbiter of justice, but as just another arena for political warfare?